I want to welcome everybody. My name is Isaac Cedarbaum. I am a rising sixth-year PhD candidate at the University of Washington's Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, where I also have my MPA from. I graduated in 2014. I'm super excited to moderate this panel. We have some really great people with us today representing a whole swath of the types of jobs that you can expect to see when you are entering the job market. I'm joined by Annette, Jesus, and Theo, and I am going to let them introduce themselves so that I'm not constantly droning on. But before we get started, I did want to thank APPAM for sponsoring this webinar. For those of you who are not acutely aware of what APPAM is, the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management was founded in 1979, and its first conference was in Chicago that same year. It is now an enormous organization. All of the major policy schools are part of it. It's a wonderful conference that happens every year. The Fall Research Conference is a great place to meet people and network and learn new things. So that is that plug. This webinar today is part of a larger agenda that we have. Myself and Eric Henderson, who is on the call, are part of the Student Activities Committee. And so part of our service is organizing webinars and panels that we think will be very helpful. And as two MPA graduates ourselves, we really thought it would be a lot of fun to have a webinar that is focused on the master's and, to a degree, undergraduate job market, because I don't know about you all, but I know when I was a master's student, there was all of this talk about the PhD job market, the capital J, capital M, the job market. And so I often was kind of perplexed of like, oh, well, I'm not a PhD and I don't know what that really means. And so we thought we'd have our demystifying the master's job market. Just to kind of give, I was talking with the career services person at my school the other day, and we were saying, I was like, what is the most, if you had one piece of advice for people who were, say, rising second and third year, so planning on graduating in the spring of 2025, and she was like, it's never too early to prepare. And I don't mean start stressing out about looking for jobs. For many people, the jobs that you will apply to will really be in the spring, unlike the PhD job market, right? It's not this kind of academic thing. And so not to stress that you should already be looking at jobs, but it's never too early to start crafting a CV, to practice writing a cover letter, to make connections with people, whether it's via LinkedIn or it's conferences, or maybe you're interested in working at a certain organization. And so you look at who works there and you find that somebody who works there is a connection of a connection, or, using your social connections to meet people, to have informational interviews is always a good idea. Today, everything that we share with you is going to be very honest, but we are not here to stress you out. We have all been through the job market and really want to impart everything that we learned and perhaps wish we knew when we did it. And so the way it's going to work is that we have some kind of overarching questions and themes we're going to talk about, but I really wanted to let the conversation be rather organic. I'm going to let our speakers kind of take it away with, like I said, some high level prompts. I am in a unique position where usually when I moderate panels, I don't really participate, but I might chime in because Jesus and I both have experience in the think tank world on two different sides of things. I was a researcher. He will talk about his programmatic work, and I'm always excited to talk about research, but I will try to kind of let the panelists shine because all three of them are amazing. We are going to talk until about 35 after, 40 after, and then we will open it up to questions because we know a big part of this is you all must have a lot of questions. So without further ado, Leslie Ofori is with APPAM and is wonderfully handling any AV and IT issues we might have. But unless there's something I've missed, I am going to first hand it over to Jesus to kick us off, and just a brief intro, kind of who you are, where you're working, and what your trajectory both into an MPA and then into the job market was like.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Isaac. Thanks for kicking us off and being here with Annette, Theo, and everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. Really excited to have this conversation. For me, it's always fun to sort of walk down memory lane a bit, just to reflect back on where one is, and then sort of thinking about how we got here and sort of what's coming up ahead as well. So I always enjoy these conversations. So my name is Jesus Guzman, pronouns he, him, él. I was originally, so I was born in Mexico. I came here as a little kid, raised in California in the Bay Area. And let's see, I currently work at the Urban Institute. I work as a policy program associate at the Research to Action Lab. I've been there now for a couple of years and primarily focus on providing technical assistance on the upward mobility framework initiative that we have here. It's a bit of a sprawling initiative that sits at the Research Action Lab here at the Urban Institute, but cuts across several of our policy centers in terms of involving a number of researchers and the place-based partnerships that we work with. So this is I can speak to that a little bit more, I think, as we go along. But my trajectory in terms of how I got to this point and then sort of where I started. When I was in probably my early 20s, I was in undergrad at Sonoma State University. I was also working as a community organizer, working with farm workers, day laborers, domestic workers. So I was a community and labor organizer. And it was at a time when I was both in this McNair Scholar program doing research as an undergrad and trying to marry sort of that research with the day-to-day work that I was doing as a community organizer. And so I was exploring questions around sort of the informal labor economy, workers' compensation, and the gaps within the social safety net that left day laborers and domestic workers primarily out of that and excluded them. So I was doing research on both of those things because it tried to answer questions that I was dealing with the folks I was working with day to day. And that opened up all these opportunities to do some research fellowships and things of the sort. And then I got connected when I did a summer fellowship during my undergrad at UC Berkeley. And my faculty advisor there was a professor at the Golden School of Public Policy. And ultimately, he was the one who encouraged me the most to apply for an MPP program. And so I ended up applying for a few MPPs, and fortunately, I got to go and study with him, Professor Rafaela at the Golden School. Shout out to him, who does really fabulous research in criminal justice policy, housing, labor, and a number of really fascinating areas. So for me, it was really applied research. Again, coming from a community organizing background and having questions about policy and systems change that had to do with the people I was working with day to day and trying to figure out what are the different tools that I can leverage to try to effectuate change, and research and data, in addition to sort of the moral argument that we were making with the folks that we were working with, along with the power building that we were doing. These were just additional tools that an MPP was able to offer and open up to really go to decision makers, policy makers, and say, these are the reasons why we need to change these policies and make these changes. And so really an MPP was a way of adding tools to the toolkit, so to speak, to advance systems change. And so that's sort of a little bit about my story about how I ended up with doing an MPP, and that's carried forward my work here at the Urban Institute. That's I can speak to a little bit more later, but just the top line of where I'm at now is that really functioning as an intermediary supporting place-based partners doing this work in community. And so having sort of sat on both sides of that equation now, both in community and then sort of in this intermediary role, has given me a sort of a vantage point into both and trying to figure out how best to support the partners we work with. So Isaac, I'll stop there and turn it back over to you.
Fantastic. I'm going to now pop it over to Theo.
Great, thanks so much for having me. My name's Theo Ritos. I work at Blue Shield of California, the health insurance company. Blue Shield of California is one of the Blues plans in a larger national consortium. There are separate ones across the country that are called Blue Cross Blue Shield. Some are just Blue Cross. We are Blue Shield. I've been working at Blue Shield for about 3 years now and recently transitioned into a role where I am a principal of enterprise planning, which means that one of my core functions, I have about 3 or 4, is to actually manage building our human capital plan. So I can speak to some of the structural and process features of building a human capital plan that are important to keep in mind as you move into the job market. There's a lot of conventional wisdom out there that I think doesn't reflect the realities of how larger organizations think about budget and planning. And knowing these things up front will make searching for jobs significantly easier. But if I roll back a little bit, so I got my bachelor's degree in government from Smith College in Western Massachusetts, where I studied primarily constitutional law. And at the time, I was interested in the relationship between con law and healthcare. So we're talking, I was in school 2008 to 2011. This was the time when the Affordable Care Act was actually being debated. And I was curious around whether or not the Constitution allows something like that and how we make policies around that. Turns out that it's perfectly legitimate according to con law. And a few years later, the Supreme Court actually decided in favor of the way I had written my thesis. So that was a big gold star for me retroactively. And then after that, I had worked at several small nonprofits that were associated with healthcare, but I graduated during the height of the recession and it was really difficult to find a job. So I worked under the table living in New York City and I sold fancy alcohol to rich people for like 2 years because it was one of the only things that I could find. And I had some friends who lived in the Bay Area, which was doing incredibly well. At that time, it was the second tech boom. So I moved out to the Bay Area with a suitcase on a whim and have been here ever since. But it hasn't been a clean and clear pathway to where my job is now. I came out here and worked for a healthcare consulting company for a couple of years because that's where a temp agency placed me. I sold fancy alcohol again because it's an easy job once you do it. And then I went and worked at a local university called the University of San Francisco. It's a private Jesuit Catholic university. And I worked in the registrar's office there. One of the advantages to working at a university is usually after a certain period of time working there, you qualify for tuition remission. I was not willing to take on any more student debt, so I wanted to get a master's degree as affordably as possible. And I was able to get a huge discount on my master's in public administration. USF is unique in that a lot of their graduate programs are actually designed for working people. So I worked a full-time job Monday through Friday, and then I was in class all day on Saturdays. And while an employee, they deducted the cost of my tuition each semester from my paychecks. So I didn't have to take out any loans for that. And I just leveraged my connections through both working at the school and within the program itself to try to apply for jobs within the market. I ended up getting a fellowship at Blue Shield of California back when the company did rotationals. My first rotation was in IT, and then my second one was within HR. When I was at the university, I was a member of a union and I became a steward, and then I bargained 2 contracts, and then I bargained concessions bargaining during the COVID crisis. So I essentially got a rapid education in how large-scale nonprofit budgets work and how you bargain for your salary and employees writ large, how you think about grievances and WARN Act, reduction in force notices. Essentially, I got a rapid HR education and I was able to braid all of those things together into my current position, which primarily focuses on thinking about the job market within the next 3 to 5 years, thinking about where healthcare is going, where Blue Shield is strategically positioning itself, and how we leverage our resources to achieve our goals. So it's been pretty meandering across the board. And I think I can offer some pretty interesting insights on how to navigate both how you get to graduate school, following graduate school, and then job hopping across the board. And with that, I'm going to give it back to Isaac.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm very excited because across the 4 of us, we have very different experiences, and we really wanted to highlight that there's no one way to enter the master's degree, to exit a master's degree, the job market, et cetera. So I'm very excited to hear from Theo, obviously, and now I'll pop it over to Annette before giving a brief introduction of myself, and then we will keep going. So Annette.
Thank you so much, and thank you, everyone. I love listening to your story. This is so inspiring, and actually, I'm going back in time and thinking like, yeah, there is not like a straight path forward. It's actually more like a bumpy road, and then you have to get very creative, kind of like ways, trying to redirect wherever you're going. So this is Annette Ramirez Valenzuela. I am a program manager at the New York City Housing Authority of, New York City right now, and Queens, Long Island City. This is the largest housing authority in the US, and we're also the largest landlord of New York City. So we have a huge responsibility. I work in the Asset and Capital Management Division in the Sustainability Department, and I am responsible for installing solar panels and the rooftops to contribute to the clean energy goals of the city And at the same time, I have another program, which is biker mobility, installing e-bike charging and storage stations at our developments that are mainly for low and moderate income New Yorkers. So this is an assignment that I took over. I started in January, and before that I was doing something not very different because I was still working on public policy, but I was working as a consultant for the World Bank, the global practice of transportation for Latin America and the Caribbean. I am Mexican. I have been living in the US for almost 3 years. And the reason how I got to the US was because I wanted to do an MPP. I chose California, I chose UCLA. And this was a big opportunity in my career because I didn't do my master's right after getting my college degree. It took me like 5 years. So I knew what I wanted. I was advised by all my mentors and professors at the time when I was in college, like as soon as you graduate, get your master's. But I was like, how am I going to make that decision if I still don't know? And it is very costly. So you have to make sure that wherever you're going, I mean, in the end, life just throws all the resources and you're able to find a way out. There's a lot of generosity from institutions, but also from our like family and our network that helps us like get through it. Before that, 5 years of working experience where I worked for the Mexican federal government on housing, social development, and my main policy interest was social like poverty. So I was very concerned about like how can we help like a country to overcome the middle income trap, which this like Mexico is as right at. And during that time, there was also like a revolution because it was everything about like how the government can help people. But then it was like we need people also shaping this policy making. And you couldn't talk about social development now without thinking about sustainability. So how did I get to the MPP? I was like, I need a flexible program. I need the tools, but I also needed that flexibility to do economics and also go to take some classes in the public health school, to take classes on climate change. And I think it's that combination of skills and different. I also took classes on geography. It was like amazing, and because cities are now like the most important like geographic like political space. So yeah, UCLA gave me that. That's how I got to meet Eric, and yeah, it's just like combination of factors. I know that once we get into the conversation, I'll be able to provide like more specific examples. But happy to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And my extremely quick introduction, my name again is Isaac Cederbaum. I am also originally from the East Coast, and I had a very nonlinear trajectory. I dropped out of college in 2008 with it's after my sophomore year. I also took a single suitcase, or rather a duffel bag, to the West Coast, and I moved to Portland, Oregon to become a bicycle mechanic. Which was a wonderful idea considering it was the recession. So, you know, we make choices when we're 21. But anyway, at that point, I started to learn a lot actually about policy, kind of inadvertently living in Portland, Oregon, which at that time was, you know, known for being the height of the bicycle capital of the country. It was very interesting. It was starting to have a lot of expansion. And so my introduction to policy was actually very informal. It was through a job that we don't necessarily associate with, but the growing pains of a city and having car and bike interactions and things like that. I ultimately decided to go back to school about 2.5 years later. And so I enrolled in Portland State University because it was affordable, and because I got a job at the bike shop at Portland State. And while I was there, I don't even remember really what the catalyst was, but I started to volunteer and took an internship, a long-term internship at the Northwest Workers Justice Project, which is a small organization that represents non-English speaking and non-native English speaking workers who need to file wage theft claims with the state but are having trouble. And so we mostly represented domestic workers and farm workers. And I just got to see a different side of the policy landscape, and I saw how policy was failing people. And so as I was wrapping up my bachelor's degree, I decided to apply to the University of Washington's law school and the Evans School. And I did not get into law school, which I jokingly say is the second best thing that ever happened to me. And when I was in my master's degree, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do until I encountered program evaluation. And at that point, I was like, I know what I want to do. I want to be an evaluator. And so when I graduated, I returned home to New York City, and I started working the majority of the time that I was back in New York for the 5 years between my master's degree and starting a PhD was at the Vera Institute of Justice. Back then, when it was center-based, I was working in the Center on Youth Justice and doing evaluation and technical assistance with states that were looking to decarcerate their youth populations or to keep kids out of the criminal legal system from the beginning. And so I had a lot of really wonderful experience there, and I learned a lot. And I bring that up also because I was hired not because I had any experience with the criminal legal system and that realm of policy, but because I knew I wanted to do research, I knew I wanted to do evaluation. And so I was like, hey, I know what I want to do skills-wise, but I don't necessarily know what I want to do policy realm-wise. And that is a complete, like, that we were going to talk next about kind of our ideas about going into the job market and what we saw our career as. And so I will use this kind of as a catalyst to say that sometimes you don't need to know the what, you just kind of want to know the how. And there's just different permutations of how looking for jobs and getting jobs can look. It doesn't have to be like I am set on doing criminal justice policy and that's the only thing I want to do. It can totally be skills-based. It can be location-based. But with that, I guess we'll continue with Annette and go with, what were your kind of early preparations when you were going into the job market, and did you have an idea of what you wanted your career to look like?
I knew I wanted to do public policy. I didn't have like policy interest, like very specific. So I like to think that the policy interest chooses you, picks you, and it's not the other way around. It's pretty much comes with how what situations you get exposed, which institutions you get to work in. So I was very lucky because I was working in very big organizations, even like the Mexican federal government, like national institutions, but also the World Bank, and now like New York City Housing Authority, which is huge. And that gives you like all the options and all the roles and just engaging with people. I think just working in a big organization from the beginning was a very important platform, so I could get a better sense on what is out there. Because when I was in college, I couldn't think exactly on what did I want to do. I just had idea about the roles, and just the roles by itself, they no longer tell you like what are you gonna do on a daily basis. And yeah, I would say it was just getting into the big organization and just figuring it out.
Wonderful. And then I guess just to continue with that before I pass it along over to Jesus, knowing that, you were sort of policies, you wanted to be doing policy research, but were a bit policy focus agnostic. How did you kind of approach the early stages of the job market, knowing that you weren't necessarily being like, oh, this is the type of policy that I want to be working within?
I think I because I had some other of my colleagues that they knew what they were the policy interests from the very beginning. Actually, after college, they started like their PhD. But for me, it was more asking. I know that there is a limit on how much you can get about an institution, a position, and a policy issue through internet. So definitely reaching out to people and connecting and having like this like in-person kind of engagement, that was very helpful for me to know like, yeah, what do you actually do? What is this policy question or policy issue about? Yeah, and it was just like a lot of learning by doing. And as soon as I got to see that a lot of policy requires management, I think I started leaning more towards management because it's like having like two brains. You have one brain, you're doing the research, you understand like the deep like roots and the cause, and you can pretty much see a regression in your brain and the stars and what causes this reality that we do not what we want to see. And then you have the other brain, like I have to get things done. And to get things done, I might have to simplify and just like establish like a route or what are going to be like the next steps, like more in a practical way. So I feel like MPPs or FPAs, we always have like these two, research and more applicable kind of like brains.
Wonderful. So I'll pass it over now to Jesus again. Again, thinking about career goals and how you approach the kind of beginning stages of the job market.
That's so funny that that brings up a regression, because I think there was a point in the MPP program where I was so excited about regressions that I was like, I gotta find a job where all I do is just regressions. I think I did a little bit of that at some point over the last few years, but yeah, it's things have changed a lot. You know, I graduated in 2018, so it's been 6 years now in the job market. I've had a couple of different jobs since then, and what my experience was like during my MPP and what I thought I wanted during that time, and sort of where I've ended up now, and sort of the journey trying to discover, you know, what type of the question, do you have an idea of the type of job that I was looking for when I was graduating? The short answer is no. And I think it's just important to like have like some grace, and just like give yourself some grace when, like, at this point when there's so much uncertainty, there's so much unknown, that I think for me, the approach I've taken for a lot of this stuff, there's a Spanish poem that says, Caminante no hay camino, el camino se hace al andar. And it translates roughly to, there is no road, you make the road by walking it. And that has been sort of my life in a lot of ways, where I'm like, I don't know, we're figuring this out as we go. And I think the only thing that's sort of primarily giving me some level of direction, right? Like, as you figure things out, the direction is mostly around this North Star of, you have your values and you have maybe your community and the people that you're trying to help through this work, right? Like, I think for me early on in undergrad, it was the people that I was working with day to day, my community, the people that I saw, right? That those were the folks I was ultimately working with towards trying to achieve some level of justice in our community. And I think that has often been sort of the anchor and the North Star around like trying to figure out. So for example, like when I finished my MPP, I went to PolicyLink and I was working there with the team of the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. And so for me, that was, I think, a way of thinking about a population, a group of people in the state of California, boys and men of color, and the way that systems through race and gender and all these different ways in which it shows up and manifests impacts a particular group of folks, that is an experience that is one that connects to me, right? And so a lot of this is in ways which policy and our own personal lives and experiences and values show up. And so for me, I was often trying to find ways to connect those two things. And my work was one way of sort of expressing that, right? Of being able to put my values into action in some way. And so I think I didn't have a type of job. I think it was trying to figure out getting really clear about what my values were and the people I was trying to impact, and then really getting clarity on that North Star, and then sort of just giving myself some grace and trying to figure things out as we go, and just being an iterative process. Like, it's a lot of my classmates that I graduated with in 2018, folks have had a few different jobs, you know, like you try something out and you're like, oh, that didn't work, I'm going to pivot, right? And so it's an iterative process. You're going to pivot, and eventually, hopefully, you'll land in a place that, at least for me, was a way of trying to align my values with the way that I was doing my day-to-day work.
Amazing. And well, speaking of pivoting, because I also want to be cognizant of time, I did want to have Theo talk a little bit about his unique position, because when we think about the job market, we think, oh, I see a job it's April, I'm graduating in May, I see a job, so I'm going to apply for it. But he's in a very interesting place that I'm going to let him talk about. But I think we agreed when we were organizing this is how a lot of large organizations and companies handle hiring. And so we wanted to also, I had no idea actually that this was even the case. And so we wanted to introduce this to you as well. So I will let Theo take it away.
Thanks. I was making some notes as Jesus was talking that are sort of a natural carry on from that. So Blue Shield is a company, I think we have $26 billion in revenue annually, and we have about 7,300 or 400 employees now. So we're considered a large organization. There are massive organizations out there like Accenture that have more than 100,000 employees. One thing to think about is when you're working with such large budgets and you're trying to accomplish both year-over-year activities as well as long-term strategic activities, there's a lot more proactive work around thinking about where you're spending what's called your labor and non-labor budget. So for context, it is July and we are building our human capital plan for next year. So all of the jobs that are going to be available next year, we are writing on a spreadsheet right now. So when you see a job posted in April, it's highly likely that months and months and months before that, it was known that it was going to open. As a result, reframe how you think about your job search. I think there is an information asymmetry amongst those offering jobs versus those who are seeking jobs. So fundamentally, when you're applying for a job or when you're looking for a job, you are applying for jobs that you know about, so you know to look for, and are currently available. But that doesn't mean that that actually reflects all of the jobs that will be available or that are available in the market itself. When it comes to networking, start thinking, it doesn't mean go out there now and spend every waking moment talking to hiring managers or companies or whatever, but think about what you're interested in, what skill set you offer, where the market is going over the next couple of years, and what you can uniquely bring to whoever you want to work with, and then approach them with a degree of curiosity around what is your organization focused on? Where do you think you're going to be focusing next year? Do you have any long-term targets that you're going for? And start to braid in your interests with what you think these different organizations are planning on doing. And then I would try to use some resources and laws that are available to benchmark yourself within the market. So think about, California and New York both have salary transparency laws now. You can look up what similar jobs are offering and start to prepare in advance for maybe the entry level job, the initial job at the company is relatively low paying, but the next step up is significantly higher. You can start to plan for that. Fundamentally, I would just say that the human capital planning process at larger companies happens significantly earlier than people think it does. And it means that you need to be a bug in someone's ear early if you want a job to be created for you, or you're trying to get top of mind for when that position opens. I would say that the final piece of advice is follow the money. Like, you need to understand where the money is coming from and what's happening within the market. I graduated from my master's program in 2020, and because it was COVID, a lot of companies actually had a revenue surplus at that point because they weren't spending on a variety of different expenses. If they didn't have large real estate footprints, if they didn't have massive outlays or accounts payable, then they were in a position to hire. But I knew that it was likely some of those positions would be short term. So that was my opportunity to get into a company, knowing it would only last about 2 years, and immediately start networking internally, like Annette said. So I think consider where the funding is coming from, where you think it's going to be coming from, and then start to think about what companies need immediately or what they need long term. And you can do that very casually now. Send a LinkedIn post, send an email, reach out to your alumni network. I would try to do a couple of these every month. My final note on that would be my personal experience, and the rule of thumb normally is when you talk to somebody, it's about 4 months later when an opportunity will show up. It's not you talk to them and they have a job appear on the job tree 3 weeks later. It's usually about 4 months or so because they're thinking about what positions are opening the following quarter. So that's what I would say is it works very differently than people think it does, and starting to learn that and get into that cycle and normalize that for yourself means that you'll be way more successful in the job market.
Wonderful. That was exceptionally helpful. Yeah, the job market obviously also looks different by the type of job. So we have 3 different representatives. We have the for-profit, the nonprofit, and the government. And so we all know, or I would say most of us have at least heard, that government hiring can take a lot of time. And while we don't have someone representing federal government jobs, Annette does work for the city of New York. And so my question to her is, what was that application process like? And kind of how long did it take? Because I know oftentimes as someone who has also applied for a government job before, it feels like your application might go into the ether, never to return. And so it is, how did you experience that?
That's a very good question. I was very lucky because it actually took between like 3 to 4 months because it was like an urgent like policy program that they wanted me to run, that in the end we were not able to run it because a lot of like legal constraints with federal funding. But yeah, at least for government positions, they take the least that they can take is like 4 months, and it can go up to a year. So yeah, that's something that they let you know. And I think also people when hiring, they're more mindful. So first interview, they tell you this is gonna take some time. It is not only that you get the check within the organization, but you also have to get the check of the Office of Management and Budget. And you also have civil service titles and so the service exams, and there's a lot of requirements that it is not only the HR of the agency where you're working, where you have to file all this documentation and they have to give you the checks. Luckily, also my position was non-competitive, which means that it has like more curriculum requirements. And eventually, I think it's like more unstable in the future. So yeah, that's something that I have to figure out soon. What was very helpful for me is just having some friends working in other agencies and just reaching out to them like pretty much like every day. I was like, I just received this. What does it mean? How much should I ask? Is this like something that is reasonable for the type of job? And then all the information is public. So I think it's very healthy asking people like, do you have any information about what's the salary range? What is the level of responsibility? And if you're going to be managing staff, and then and there are like other questions to be addressed. And also my experience with the nonprofit, I think nonprofit is more constrained to budget because they receive grants, and grants can only be allocated with certain restrictions. So they can put together like a very nice profile that fits like what you do, but in the end they might not be able to put together like a good offer, and that's when the private takes the time.
Wonderful. Yeah. 3 to 4 months is, again, hearing it's like, it is funny to hear like, and that is a quick turnaround, but that's true for government. So it is, I'm glad that we have someone who can attest to like, that is, we're truly working on different timelines. So, Jesus, representing the nonprofit or think tank world, just what was your job market experience like? If you could, when you were, after you had graduated, kind of how long did it take? And is that kind of consistent across the jobs that you've had since?
Yeah, I think all my jobs since graduating have been in the nonprofit sector. The two of them have been in sort of research institutes. And I think one thing that's always been really important and it's been helpful in each one of those places that I knew somebody that was working there or had worked there. And so I say that because just the value of networking is really important. It's something that I don't feel super comfortable doing. I don't feel super comfortable reaching out because I feel like I'm bothering people and I want to just share with folks here that being on the other side of the equation as an alumni, one thing that I often do is to try to make myself available for students, certainly at the program I graduated from at Goldman, but certainly for anybody here, if anybody wants to touch base after. We love talking, like for alumni, we love talking to folks. That's why we're doing it. That's why Theo and myself, I think we're all doing this. We love having these conversations because I think in a lot of ways we want to share what we've learned. But when I was on the other side of that, in terms of reaching out, it felt like I was imposing on people. And so it, in some ways, slightly ironic because it was through those, like forcing myself to reach out to people that I ended up going through those relationships and those connections that I had to learn about a workplace, right? And ask questions about, what certainly the basics around like, what is the salary range? What is this job? Because I'll tell you what, like in being in the think tank research institutes, like the job titles don't make sense. They don't make sense. Like you read it and you're like, what does that mean? Policy coordinator, research analyst, policy program associate, it all just feels like a word soup where I'm like, I don't totally know if that's like here, like does this qualification match that? And so that's like at Urban, that's our fault. Like our titles are not great. We're working on it, trying to make that a lot more intuitive and more transparent. But it really helped to know people and to be able to ask them those questions. So again, reaching out, networking, I think is really valuable. And then I think just one more note about the sort of this space, the sector of research institutes. Something that Theo actually touched on earlier is sort of the winds of capital, so to speak. We have something similar, but it's sort of the seasonality that connects to who is in power in DC and the different administrations. And this is true for center, center left, conservative, like there's research institutes across the political spectrum, and there's administrations that come in and out of power in DC. But what seems to be a pattern is that depending on sort of your own policy interests, different federal agencies, for example, will be hiring based on sort of the shift in administration. So I think when I was going in, it was the Trump administration. I started in 2016. And so Trump was coming in office. And so there was people that were, for example, at that time leaving, right? And they were going to research institutes. And when Biden came in, there were folks that I sort of knew as well that were going into the administration and to HUD and to CDC and all these different places, right? And so just knowing that sort of government has its own, is affected by seasonality based on administrations, job openings will become available, or depending on where you're looking, maybe research institutes are looking to hire, right? So I think the reason that that's salient right now is we're in an election year, we're only a few months away. And so as you all are thinking about your job prospects, that may mean in January, right? You may be looking at something at a federal agency, or you may be looking at something in research institutes, and sort of the flow of employment will sort of vacillate between those. So.
Wonderful. Yeah, my one quick anecdote to add to that is that I was at Vera I started in 2015 and I was there in 2016. And obviously with the election, or maybe not obviously, but with the election of Donald Trump, all of a sudden there was an influx of cash to the organization, but it wasn't until the following spring in say like May, June. And so all of a sudden we were hiring because his policies that were enacted very quickly were spurring people to donate to our organization. And so sometimes an election can spur jobs in ways that aren't necessarily that you wouldn't expect. I want to be really cognizant of time. And so just to wrap up, I'll start with Jesus and then Theo and then Annette. If you, for 30 seconds, if there's one piece of advice you would give to yourself when you were heading into the second year of your MPA or MPP, what would it be?
I'll kick us off if I may, since I have one top of mind. One piece of advice that was really helpful for me in my MPP was doing as much client-based projects as possible. And so there's a couple of ways to do that. Some of those were ones that my MPP program required. And so whether it was my first year, second year, summer, I had at least 2, 3 client-based projects that were already designed in the curriculum. But then I also use, if that isn't an option or there isn't as much of that in your program, I also did one through individual study. And so that was something I had to get approval from, but then I worked with a professor, and professors know a lot of people, right? Like they're doing research and stuff with other folks in the field. And so that's another avenue to explore, is depending on how much client-based project is designed into your curriculum or not, individual study should probably be an option. And so connecting with a professor and adding, and it was interesting because my client-based projects ran the gamut. I had started with sort of labor and immigrant rights as my background, and most of those were ones I did with renewable energy, climate change, local economic development agencies. So I sort of explored very different areas, feeling like an MPP, this was sort of a safe space to take a risk and try different things that I probably wouldn't try otherwise. And so the reason client-based projects were also really important was because then when I went into the job market and was looking to apply, I think it was a lot easier to sell an employer of like, I've produced a deliverable for a client, and here was the process I did that, and you can call them as a reference. And that already was job experience, right? So it's both like I'm a student, I'm meeting my curriculum requirements, but I'm also gaining job experience that is salient that I can then sell in the job market a lot easier. And so client-based work, I think, was really, really valuable, and something I think is worth folks exploring as much as possible in your time in an MPP or MPA program.
Wonderful. So Theo, same question. If you could give one piece of advice to yourself.
I think as somebody who used to work at a university, the goal of the program is for everyone exiting the program to come out with the same baseline skills. So your skills are not necessarily a differentiator. It's what you're interested in, where you have focused and developed a degree of expertise and what you've delivered, and try to take advantage of non-traditional opportunities that are a differentiator. So for me, when I was in graduate school, I took an entire class on the census, and at the time the census was actually actively being conducted. I got connected with a representative for the city and county of San Francisco, and I did live data analysis for them week over week. So I learned how to read census data. I learned how to map it against the American Community Survey data so that they could deploy resources within San Francisco to try to increase response rates. And that ended up being really transformative for me because I learned about how nonprofits and governments form these different coalitions, how they think about resourcing, where they're targeting, things like that, how they're using data, how they're not using data. And that person has gone on to work in several government jobs, and we've stayed connected. So just think about what your differentiating factor is and try to focus on that. And the tiny little tidbit, like Jesus said, is it is perfectly normal to reach out to people. Nobody is bothered. Do it often, all the time, please.
Absolutely. Okay. And finally to Annette.
Thank you. I'll be quick because as soon as I graduated from the MPP, I was like, should I have done an MBA maybe? So business classes, just governments alone and nonprofits alone cannot do all the work. And I feel like sometimes we see government or these entities as the decision makers because maybe an authority, but yeah, the private sector understanding what are the incentives. So taking some law or business classes, I think that would be super helpful to more in the practical way, like how to establish partnerships with them. For example, now for the New York City Housing Authority, this is a no cost for NYCHA project because there are tax incentives and the private sector is able to fund all the capex for the solar system. So it is amazing what private money can do.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time and your amazing and varied experiences. I want to open it up. I know we're a little bit behind schedule, but we are a small-ish group. And so questions that can be to the full panel, that can be to individuals. We would love to hear what's on your mind. Amber.
Thanks so much for everything you shared today, and thank you all for your time. For me, I just recently graduated from a master's program in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Mellon, and actually in the communication field, and more specifically in rhetoric. And I chose kind of like a non-traditional approach. So I like that you all touched on like finding your interest, even if you're in an environment that maybe does something different. And so I looked at like the rhetoric of policy, which is like what people in communication fields are mostly not looking at, like a lot of times centered on writing pedagogy or kind of like those client cases that you talked about in communications consulting. But then it's been hard in trying to break into the policy like market or industry, if you will, because no matter how much relevant experience you have, people are looking for MPPs. And now I have a master's degree that I'm like worried is not relevant. And so I guess being that you all touched a little bit on like non-traditional pathways and even like doubting some of your choices or academic programs, like what tips do you have for people who are shifting into policy, especially as we're like maybe undergoing a time of transition with administration, maybe without an MPP?
I have some things that come to mind. So the first one is no organization operates in isolation. So if there's like a policy org that you really like that you want to work with, figure out who they're working with and go work for one of those partners, right? So if like a policy org works with a really well-known PR firm, for instance, get in the PR firm and then use the connections through those client relationships to move your way where you want to. Like there's these massive there's studies that show that basically network effects create aggregated output. Figure out whatever that network is, and you can work your way in within a couple of years. Be charming, do good work, and somebody will eventually say, hey, it looks like you're really good for this thing, or would you be interested in this? You work on these comms projects for us all the time. You might as well come in-house. So try to figure out like the places that you want to work, figure out who they're working with, and then work your way in through the concentric rings.
The other thing that's great advice. The other thing that I'll add, and this is, I'm excited that this is a great example of what you should do. First of all, working at Vera, we had a large comms organization. No one had an MPP or MPA, right? They were coming from one of my coworkers and now friends had worked in publishing, right? But was really drawn to the mission of Vera and decided to veer, right? And so organizations, especially think tanks like Vera and Brookings and Urban, but also there are government entities too who have a robust comms department. Comms is a natural part of policy, as you literally studied. And so I wouldn't let that dissuade you from applying. There's also, you know, a lot of these jobs, I love the MPAA and MPP, but a lot of these jobs also hire people from all across the board, people who have social work degrees or law degrees. And so don't let it really just say like, oh, well, I don't have it. And therefore maybe I'm not eligible. The other thing, and why I was kind of giggling that this will show you this in practice, is that I know a lot of people who work in, they were my old coworkers. And so you should email me. Our emails will be available. And if you would like to talk to people who are in comms or were in comms within the policy field, they love talking to people, and I would happily set you up. So this is the example of you never know who knows people, and it's always worth following up with people. So I'll make sure you get my email. Let's go to Michael and hear your question.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Excellent. Well, thank you all for this discussion. It's been very insightful. I appreciate it. My question is what are some things to think about when you're considering moving to another state to find work? I think in today's age, you really can't afford to stay put where you are a lot of times. So I'm just wondering from your experience, and that we touched on it some today, what are just some things in general to think about when you're considering relocating?
Yes, Annette, do you have, since you went to school on the West Coast and live on the East Coast?
Yeah, and it took some time adjusting to the cost of living in New York. It's still processing. Um, but I think what is the experience that you're gonna get is that what you evaluate and then you establish like how many years you will be willing to reallocate and adapt to this new, because it changes a lot. It goes from weather to cost of living to transportation, like going from LA to New York City. In some ways it was good, and in other ways you kind of miss just not racing like 2/3 of the year. So yeah, it's like, what is the experience? What am I gonna get? And yeah, just to have like this north that Jesus was mentioning, like who am I gonna help, and how this experience is gonna make me like better, more prepared, and then just expand myself for future opportunities.
Thank you.
Or Jesus, any thoughts about relocating?
I mean, I've been in California for 30 years, so I can't, I'm fortunate to speak to that.
I would say, so a +1, what Annette said, you have your personal considerations, and then you have your professional considerations. Some of those intersect, like, you know, how much money you make or the general cost of living. Personal ones, yeah, please think about the weathers. A lot of people are highly affected by the weather, and if you have seasonal affective disorder, maybe don't live somewhere that's dark 10 months of the year. So just think about those personal things. I would think too around, like, depending on how long you plan to be there, where you think your life is going. So New York City has a lot of infrastructure for families, and that's a really strong consideration. One of my culture shocks in moving to the Bay Area was, although the Bay Area is considered progressive as well, New York offers many things that are actually free. Like the public pools are free for you to be able to get into. That is not true in the Bay Area. Almost nothing is straight up free. So thinking about that, where you want your life to be, if you're planning to have kids, think about the school system, stuff like that. Professionally, the one thing I would offer up that many people don't think about is if you're working in policy, it does take a while to understand the legacy of local government. So learning about, for instance, here, Oakland City government, the relationship between the Oakland police and the federal government, thinking about county government, where money comes from. It does take a while to understand local government, the relationships between local and state and federal. And so try to pick somewhere where you're willing to put in the time, because getting acclimated to that and building those connections does take time, but that's really what makes your professional career in the areas that we're talking about.
The one thing I will also add is it can be helpful in moving to a place like New York or DC to simply move there ahead of time. I have friends who did that. They knew they wanted to work in DC. They didn't have a job upon graduation, but they moved there. And yes, it was hard and they had to really prioritize in the beginning, like extremely affordable housing, but it allowed them to be on the ground and immediately apply to jobs, to be able to connect with people in person in a way that is possible, especially in this post-COVID era, to do via Zoom, but it can be very helpful to be in person. The other thing that I'll add is that when I applied to Vera the first time, I applied in March of 2015 and I didn't get the job. But I was a kind of last round candidate, got to the final round. All of this is in person. I didn't get the job, but then a job posting opened again in November of 2015, and they immediately called me, and I was able to just show up because I lived in New York City. And so if you know that that's something you want to do, you want to relocate, it can be very advantageous, but it can also be very hard because you're obviously relocating and might not have a job. The final piece that I'll say to that too is that, and I don't mean this to scare people at all, but it was a piece of advice I really appreciated, is that I was having an informational interview with someone in a very small policy organization here in Seattle back in 2014, just to talk about when I thought I would perhaps stay in Seattle instead of moving back home. And he said, you might have to take a service industry job, right? And there's not, like, because you need to eat and you need to pay rent. And it was kind of a gut punch initially, but he was being honest, and he was like, you know, you need to do the things for you and you need to be able to pay for stuff. And so that's not a failure. That's just the kind of reality of the situation. And people understand that too. And so regardless of what happens to you in the initial months after graduation, everything is experience. I wouldn't see it as a failure. Not that, you know, anyone is saying that, but that was something that at the time was, I didn't like it, but now 10 years later, I was like, that's actually a wonderful piece of advice. Are there any other questions or comments? I'm trying to monitor the chat as well. We have about 2 minutes, so if anyone has a final question, we'd love to hear it.
Hi, sorry, I don't know how to raise my hand.
Oh, you're fine. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. This is really helpful. I'm about to graduate, but my program is a master's in education policy at Teachers College Columbia, and I was wondering if that was too limiting to get like an ed policy degree. I guess like Amber, I'm a little worried how transferable it is, what kind of jobs I can apply for and reasonably expect that they will hire me.
I would say a few things come to mind. Do a skills inventory for yourself, right? So think about all the stuff that you've ever worked on. What are the transferable skills? If you've done anything data, you could get a job pretty much anywhere, because having worked at several companies now, they might say that they're data driven, but there's usually like 4 people in a room that do all the data. So if you're good at that, that's awesome. So do a skills inventory, think about like what you offer, then think about what you've delivered and the value that it's provided. So if you've done X, here are some of the impacts. If you did research on Y, what were some of the things that maybe in the larger macroeconomic circumstance have worked out for you? And then the last one is, like I said before, think about the network effects. So for instance, my friend used to be a public school teacher in Oakland, has a master's in education, moved to New York, and they could, for some reason, not transfer their teacher's license. New York just didn't allow them. They denied the transfer for a variety of bureaucratic reasons. And my friend went and worked for a literacy organization and now works for Sesame Workshop and teaches thousands of teachers every year. So it's a meandering pathway how you get there. Just think about what you can offer. You're mostly trying to sell yourself. And if you're smart, personable, and you have the skills that are needed for the job, you can get a job pretty much anywhere.
One quick addition to that, just education policy. I mean, the question is that too limiting? And the answer is no. And I think this is one piece of advice I would offer is, I would recommend you spend some time thinking about how education intersects with other policy areas. And so for my work, thinking about economic upward mobility, there's all of these different policy domains: housing, education, all of these different policy domains connect in different ways. And so I would encourage you to think about, how does education show up when it comes to affecting housing and evictions and tenant protections, and finding those intersections and those points of common ground, because then you could make a stronger case going to a place like Vera or Urban or all these places and saying, here's how education shows up and impacts all these other areas of a person's life, right? And so in that way, it's not so much limiting as much as a value add that intersects with all of these other elements of people's lives.
The last thing that I'll add, and then we can, Leslie has graciously said we do have 10 more minutes if people do have more questions, although obviously people should feel free to go. So I did a lot of hiring right before I left Vera, and check the positions, because a lot of times positions, especially if they require just a master's degree, like, or aren't expecting a lot of experience, you know, like I said, I was hired because I could do statistics, right? I had no experience with the criminal legal system other than a close friend who had gotten kind of caught up in it, but I hadn't studied it. And so really thinking about the skills that you bring, and to Jesus's point, like how you can make connections, because we would ask people open-ended questions of like, oh, you know, what do you see as one of the biggest issues within the criminal legal system right now? And so I wouldn't worry at all. I mean, we hired plenty of masters of social work and people who are like, oh, I actually want to, you know, I took some stats classes, but I really want to concentrate on doing research. And we have people who were highly quantitative but really wanted to go into programmatic work. And so it's really, I think, and, you know, and Theo had said this too, it's really about leveraging the things that you have and the things that you want to do. But I would never worry, similar to how we were saying it to Amber too, I would never worry about what you have as being too limiting. We're not in a field like the heart, you know, you're not trying to go into biology or chemistry where there's a very explicit skills that are needed that like I sure could not do. You know, I haven't been in a science room since high school, but we're in a field that is so interdisciplinary that it's really about what you bring to the table, and you will learn so much that it could be in 5 years you don't even really think about the fact that you have an education policy degree. You think of yourself as someone who works in policy. Again, I want to be cognizant of time and see if there's any kind of last minute questions. Otherwise, thank you so much to everybody. We will make sure that our email addresses are accessible. Find us on LinkedIn. Please feel free. We clearly love talking, but we are here. We have been where you are and really would like to help. And so find us. If you're coming to APPAM, find us and say hello. I know I will be there. I'm very excited. Let's go with one last question from Kelsey, and then we will say our formal goodbyes.
Hi, I just had a quick question to see if anyone on the panel knew anyone from their program who had gone on to work internationally, and if you had any advice on how they found those opportunities. And then if there's anything that you can do while you're in the program, because I'm actually starting at UCLA in 2 months for the MPP program. So if there's anything that I could be thinking about now about how I can set myself up for those opportunities, like for instance, I'm planning on pursuing the Global Affairs certificate that they offer. But just honestly, like any advice that you have would be great to hear.
I did the GPA certificate, so I took classes with Steve Cummins. He's very well connected with nonprofits, international nonprofits in DC. He's from the Urban and Planning department, and also the Young Professionals program from World Bank. I think towards the end of your first year, it takes a year that you can start applying for that. Yeah, I just taken a lot of trips to DC because International American Development Bank is there. Also, the World Bank, UN is here in New York. So yeah, I think for international property, it requires a lot of like being in person and attending like some events here. But I know Global Public Affairs organized like a trip, an annual trip to DC with other Alaskan students. So that should be like a good opportunity.
My roommate in grad school got the Fulbright, and that kind of, and she was in Kosovo for a year, and that kind of, she leveraged that. She worked for OECD in Europe, but there's, similar to what Annette said, there's a whole bunch of organizations that I would look at now and try to make connections now. knowing that you want to do that. If you have cohort mates that have done Peace Corps, definitely talk to them and make those connections now, because a lot of people who are Peace Corps alums have global connections.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we have reached our time. Again, for those who are left, I really appreciate your time. Tell your friends to, connect with us if they have questions too. And I hope to see you all at APPAM. Thank you so much for attending.